can be hairy, but you got to work through it and you'll come out stronger. So we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So we're going to define crises. We're going to do an overview of what's a crisis, also handling it, best practices, of course, that's the name of our presentation, but also to being proactive and talking about the importance of having a protocol. I can speak from experience that when I was in-house, we had a crisis at a law firm, and we didn't have a crisis communications protocol when the crisis hit. Soon after, we had one, trust us. So it's good for a company to really, even if they don't think a crisis will happen, think again. Next slide, please. We encourage questions throughout the presentation as well. So defining a crisis, crises, they don't discriminate, and each is unique. But having a protocol, at least a communications protocol, which is part of the crisis management team, at least you don't have to worry about the communicating during crisis. Our job is communicating. Leadership can take care of taking care of the crisis, and that's where the two work together to make sure we're communicating. So no organization is immune, and how a company responds to a crisis really defines how they get through it. So if you notice, some companies that get slammed in the media, chances are they really bungled it internally, or they made poor leadership decisions. That's what gets them in trouble. Now, the beauty of communications, and this is what the parts that's so rewarding is, the communications team is a sounding board to leadership. So leadership that really values their communications professionals and is open to having difficult conversations and making decisions based on feedback, they position themselves up better to get through any crisis. Next slide, please. So the first step is really defining across crises, because each is unique. And this is a slide we use in creating protocols for our clients, actually. And it's a great brainstorming slide. It gets people thinking about, regardless of what industry, right? It gets them thinking about, well, what would be an issue? What would be an issue that we might need to take care of within 24 hours? Well, what's a serious issue? And it's like this brainstorming of scenarios. However, this slide is really helpful in terms for especially management and communications working together. And this is why communication should really be in the loop with top tier, not top tier media, top tier the management, high management and leadership, is because they can provide a valuable sounding board and also talk through certain things. So for example, if we have an issue that occurred at any company, let's say it was an HR issue where it was, someone harassing someone. How a company addresses that will dictate the trajectory of how it plays out in the long term, right? So let's say a company decides to ignore it. Again, it's ultimately up to leadership and how they deal with a crisis. And then the communications team creates a communications protocol around that, or drafts or whatever, advises on communications. Let's say if they ignore it, well, what do you know? Let's say if there are a few more complaints about the same person. Maybe some other people are mirroring that behavior. It becomes a serious issue. So it's just escalated. So then again, work with the communications team. Let's say management decided still not to do anything, because honestly, a lot of people want problems to go away, and that's the worst thing you can do in crisis communications and also dealing with a crisis. Let's say they didn't deal with it though, and bam, they get sued. They get sued for harassment, and it's in the media, it leaks. Now that's a full-blown crisis. So it's good to have a protocol where certain things that do pop up, get them one this small. Because let's say if they did address the issue when it was just an issue and there was wrongdoing, we would have probably gotten rid of the person, and then they'd have to deal with a smaller problem, and then it would go away. So this slide is very helpful for companies. Next slide, please. Now, if you don't have a crisis communications protocol, and we're going to get into details about that, we really strongly recommend that. It just makes handling a crisis so much more smoothly, so leadership can focus on the crisis at hand. But if you don't, and you find yourself in a crisis, these are just some high-level tips. So again, determine the level of impact, and really think it through, and not be afraid to have difficult conversations and with leadership and say, okay, well, various scenarios. Then pull the crisis, depending on what the crisis is or the incident, pull the necessary department heads. Let's say if it is an HR issue, bring in the HR person, and Melissa will get into more details about creating an ad hoc crisis response team later. But really pull in the point people and definitely have someone in communications there, because communications folks are usually the conduit internally, and then if it ever leaks externally, they're the conduit from external, like i.e. reporters inquiring about what's going on within your company. So essentially gather all facts. That's really a no-brainer. And please don't be reactive. Get as much information as you can. Check the sources, make sure it's accurate. Identify your audiences, internal and external, and draft appropriate messaging. And that's where we're here to help. And then it's not a one-off. Keep an eye on the situation. Be there and watch as it evolves, and make sure you are keeping all parties internally in the loop, because they need to be, so they can determine the next step. And then if any media coverage, you anticipate any, give an internal heads up to the appropriate folks, maybe senior leadership. And then step back. Throughout, always reflect and analyze. But let's say fast forward to the end of a crisis, step back and reflect, not only on the communications front, with leadership, sit down and say, okay, what could have been done differently with leadership? What could have been done on the communications? What worked? So these are just little best practices, so you can really get through a crisis, but then even land stronger. So now I'm going to pass it off to Melissa.
Awesome. Thanks, Claire. So as Claire mentioned, a big part of your crisis communications plan is forming a crisis management team. So who that needs to involve, and it's the same for every size business. So if you're a small business, medium, large, we recommend that you always have somebody from leadership, whether it's the entire leadership team or the owner, the CEO, someone from leadership, someone from communications, whether you have an internal communications person who work with an agency like us at Matter, or if you have, a consultant that you can reach out to, have a communications professional. Also someone from your legal team, whether you have someone in-house or you work with a law firm or consult with a lawyer, always have someone from legal as a part of that team, and someone from the operations, finance, HR side. So whether you have, 3 different people or you just have an HR person that handles all of those things, you definitely want those 4 key components. And as part of that team, whether it's 4 people or, can go up to 8, 10, 20, depending how big the company is, you want to have a crisis management team lead. And usually we recommend that that's the communications professional, whether it's someone internally, whether it's someone from your agency or a consultant. But really the job of that person is to, wrangle all the troops when a crisis hits, get everybody together in the same room, or hopefully in the same room, or now virtually on Zoom, get everybody together to discuss next steps, to discuss all different scenarios. And one other thing we like to point out, that should your crisis be, say customers' information was hacked, you want to have somebody from your IT team or your product team that really knows how it happened, how to prevent it, and what information that you can share publicly with customers. So depending on the crisis, you might want to pull other different people in, but leadership, legal, communications, finance, HR is your core crisis management team. So then getting into some of the best practices. Now you know the different types and levels of a crisis. You have your crisis management team together. Now what do you do? Well, like Claire said, coming off of that lovely meditation session, you remain calm. As hard as that might seem, because you're anxious, you want to get the word out there to put out the fire of this crisis. Remain calm, get as much information as possible. You have your crisis management team together in the same room or virtually. You have all your facts as you start to look through different scenarios. Another thing to do while you're gathering all your information and regrouping is make sure you have alerts set up for your company, your leadership, competitors, and different industry trends. So typically that's something we have an agency. We do that for all of our clients. We set up Google alerts, and we have media databases that we set up alerts to track this. So should a crisis come through that you might not even be aware of, that comes through a piece of coverage, you get those alerts. And, if you're meeting with your crisis management team trying to figure things out and, the news, your local TV station is picking this up, you're not watching the news, right? You're trying to figure out how to handle this crisis. So you want to make sure you have those alerts so that, okay, we need to get a response together ASAP. The media is already picking up on this. The next thing, you want to be aware of feedback and sentiment for your company. So think of all the pros and cons. What could be the positive outcome of this? What could be the negative outcome of this? That could be a long-term effect. And really start your crisis protocol with that in mind. Another one that's hard to do, but leave emotions at the door. As I said, try to be calm, stick to the facts. They'll determine how you best handle the situation. As much as everybody loves their company, service, product, and you want to defend them to the utmost degree, if something happens and you have to admit you made a mistake, okay, have your crisis management team and you'll put together the appropriate message to convey to the public. And last but not least, just maintain integrity, transparency, and honesty. That's the best thing you can do in a crisis because at the end of the day, you just want to be honest and transparent about everything as you move forward. So then this is a slide we wanted to share. It's a slide we use with our clients, show you all the different possible stakeholders that could be affected by a crisis. And that goes from customers to boards of directors, to employees, to investors, to the media, to the local community. And there's different ways that you should respond about crisis to these stakeholders. So we probably do not have enough time to go through all of these different options, but I'll use customers for an example. So you're, say you are, I use this the other day, a lettuce company, and we had recalls with romaine lettuce and E. coli. So you have customers that have bought your lettuce and you're worried about it. Well, how are you going to convey to customers, this is what happened, these were the dates, this is what we're doing, don't worry, it'll be okay, here's the steps to take. Possible materials you can put together, a press release, you can put together draft responses, questions you might get. Should media call you and say, what about this, what about that? And put together key talking points to address any possible question you think you could get. And with the press release, sometimes we would recommend doing a paid press release so it gets picked up by a bunch of different news outlets. So you're really covering your basis, getting your statements across. You can also do an email communication if you have a content marketing email system like Constant Contact, for instance. You could send a blast out to your customers letting them know this is what happened, these were the dates that it was affected, and this is what we're doing. So that's just an example of the different avenues you can take to address your crisis. And then last but not least, just a nice bulleted list of all of the do's for a successful campaign. So avoid knee-jerk reactions, pretty much staying calm, leave emotions out of it. Reflect, act, and be factual. Don't give any false promises. Stick to the facts and know the things that you can promise to your customers, to the public. Be empathetic and authentic. Move swiftly yet responsibly. That's a big thing. You want to respond right away, but you need to think through all these things we're talking you through, to make sure you don't have any negative consequences or you react too quickly. And have qualified individuals speak on technical topics. Like I said, if your company and customers' information is hacked, maybe have your CEO and your CTO speak upon it. You want to make sure that whoever's speaking can address any question that's thrown their way. If an issue involves a third party, whether it's a customer or a partner, make sure they're involved throughout this whole process. Know anything internal can also be external. So anything you share internally, you need to be prepared that, employees can forward this out or take screenshots and share on social media. It's just the age we live in. So anything you share internally, make sure you're okay should anybody in the public see it. Be prepared for an issue to escalate. So, just be prepared for the worst case scenario, and you can never communicate enough, over communicate.
Great, thanks, Melissa. So to kind of expand on the anatomy of a crisis response, something that we typically put together for our clients and recommend that businesses do is put together holding statements. So this is an approved message that can be relayed, adapted, or used to communicate with your different stakeholder groups. So it's basically a canned statement, but you can adapt it as needed depending on the audience of the message. But it's something that, especially if it's a common issue that maybe your business encounters, having that in your back pocket will just make everything go more smoothly and more quickly. So kind of as we've been echoing throughout this presentation, timing is so key. Silence can actually be the worst thing for your reputation, and it's so important that when you're putting together these messages, even if it's at the very start of an issue, that you're showing that you're aware of it and that you're taking action. So I think a really great example from earlier this year was around employee safety with COVID, or even around social justice and the BLM movement, of making sure that employees and your stakeholders understood the actions that you were taking to either keep them safe or to possibly solve racial inequities in your business. So having that action part of it is so key. Crises, as we've also mentioned, are fluid situations. So holding statements may change over the course of a situation, but they are meant to show that consistent voice and message throughout. Obviously, sticking to the facts is important, and the spokesperson should be determined for the severity of the situation. So you might not necessarily always want your CEO to be the spokesperson, especially if you're trying to downgrade the situation. So really think through, what are we trying to communicate? How severe is this situation, and who is the appropriate person? As Melissa mentioned, if it's an IT issue, maybe it's someone on your IT team that is actually the spokesperson, because they can speak to the technical nature of the issue. And obviously, never lie. You will always get caught. And if you need to bring in that outside legal counsel, because they may be the most appropriate person to speak, depending on the issue. As we've also mentioned, the post-crisis reflection is so important. You need to come together with your team and really understand, what could you be doing better? What could you do more of when another situation arises? So things like, how did we do? What did we forget? What was the feedback from our different stakeholder audiences? What are the long-term impacts on our business? Do we need to shift our business strategy? Do we need to shift our communication strategy? And what more could we be doing? There's also that possibility that you might need a secondary response. Is there something you need to be thinking of 2 weeks from now as a follow-up to the situation? Crises are not cookie cutter, so you really, we encourage our clients to learn from every experience so that you can be more effective and efficient the next time something happens, whether it's small or large. And finally, as we've alluded to, we do highly recommend businesses of all sizes, small and large, to consider a protocol. Crises do happen to everyone, and when we say a protocol, it doesn't have to be this fancy document. Most of the time it's just a Word document, but it outlines some of the key things that we've just talked through. So defining what a crisis means to your company or your industry. So what are those different categories? What are those buckets you need to be keeping an eye out for? Outlining who at your organization is involved and how to contact them. And I think especially in this remote environment, we need to know how to get a hold of each other, because we can't just stop by the office and talk things through. And then the full details of a framework. So the protocol is not meant to be the be-all and end-all. It's that framework for you to work from that shows the procedure and the people that you should be contacting should an issue arise. So it's essentially just the general steps that you need to be taking to make sure that you're thinking through all the different stakeholders, that you're thinking through all the different possibilities, all the different communications that you should be considering. And it's so important that the company and in general, not just your CMT, is aware of the protocol and the right people in the organization to contact should something happen. So whether that's your managers or your team leads, making sure that they understand who they need to contact if something were to happen at a customer site or on a job site, to make sure that everything is handled quickly and appropriately. Another fun thing that we love to do and we highly encourage is running drills with your crisis team. So especially if you work in an industry with inherent risk like construction or something with security, things that have those inherent risks with them are definitely areas where you should be practicing. Whether it's a likely or an unlikely scenario, as we've said, you need to prepare for the best case and the worst case scenarios, at any point. So, it's important to really understand your protocol, not just drafting it up. You need to know what's in that document and make sure the people that need to know about it know about it. And then finally, as we said, you need to review your protocol. We recommend, at a minimum 1 to 2 times a year, but quarterly is preferred, and especially after each crisis. So as we mentioned, reflecting on what went wrong, what could have done better, what went great, and making sure that that's all reflected in the plan. And finally, some related policies that we urge companies to consider are 2 employee-facing documents, so a media policy and a social media policy. So these just outline the different ways of who's qualified to speak to the media on behalf of the company, what should employees do if they're contacted by a member of the media. On the social media front, it's how employees are expected to interact with the company on social media. Should they share customers? Should they share images of customer sites? What about proprietary product information? It really just outlines kind of what's expected of them in that public sphere. And then the final piece is the social media crisis protocol. So obviously crises can happen anywhere. They're not just limited to the internal and external business operations. It's also in that digital sphere, especially now more than ever, because we're all attached to our phones and computers. So having those guidelines in place for if a situation were to arise on social media, so say you get a really high profile customer review that's nasty, you want to make sure you know how to handle that, but also what happens to the company's social channels if you are stuck in crisis mode? Do you react on social media? Do you stay silent? What's the protocol there? Especially because a lot of companies do have other outside parties handling their social media. You want to make sure that that they're aware of how they should be handling things should a situation arise. So I know we have a few minutes left, so we figured we would leave the floor open to any questions. I know the 3 of us have had our fair share of crises across industries, so we're more than happy to share our experiences.